My mom said, no one would ever love me if I cut my hair. When I was 14, my brother Silas's hair got caught in the chain on the swing set and started ripping his scalp off. And while he was screaming and bleeding, my mom just stood there yelling, "Why weren't you more careful with it?" Mom was completely obsessed with long hair on men. She came from this family where all the men had hair down to their ankles, and they called it their crowning glory or whatever. Her own father had hair so long he had to carry it in his arms to walk, and Mom kept this massive photo of him in the living room like he was royalty. When she married Dad, his hair was down to his waist, and apparently when I was born, the first thing she said was, "I can't wait to see how long his gets." Every single night, Mom would brush my hair for an hour while going on about how hair was a man's true beauty, and cutting it was basically a sin. She wouldn't even let us trim split ends. Dad's hair was down past his knees, and he had constant migraines from the weight. He couldn't drive because his hair would get stuck in the seatbelt or tangled around the gear shift. One time, he tried to pull it back in a bun, and Mom screamed, "What's the point of having beautiful hair if you're going to hide it like you're ashamed?" Silas was 12, and his hair literally dragged on the ground behind him. Mine was down to my thighs. We had to wash it every day with this $50 shampoo and spend hours detangling it while Mom watched to make sure we weren't pulling out too many strands. When I was 7, I snuck into the bathroom with Dad's sewing scissors and cut off like 6 in. I just wanted to be able to run without stepping on my own hair. I thought if I only cut a little bit, Mom wouldn't even notice. But when she came to brush my hair that night, she saw the uneven ends and completely lost it. She didn't yell at first, which was somehow worse. She just got really quiet and said, "You've destroyed something precious that can never be replaced." Then she left and came back with this wig that went all the way down to the floor. She made me wear it every single day until my real hair grew back to the length it was before. The wig was so heavy I got neck pain and headaches, and it was like 3 FT longer than my actual hair, so I was constantly tripping over it. Kids at school made fun of me and I'd come home crying, but Mom would just say, "Good, maybe now you'll understand why you should appreciate your real hair." I had to wear that thing for almost 2 years, and I never tried to cut my hair again after that. Mom built a swing set because she wanted us to play outside with our hair blowing in the wind like some shampoo commercial. Dad said it wasn't safe, but Mom insisted we needed fresh air. Silas got on the swing and started going pretty high, and his hair was whipping everywhere. Then I heard this sound like fabric tearing, and Silas started screaming. His hair had wrapped completely around the chain, and when the swing came back down, it just pulled. There was blood pouring down his neck and this chunk of scalp hanging by like an inch of skin, and he was making these horrible choking sounds. Mom ran over, but instead of helping him, she just stared at all the hair stuck in the chain and said, "Do you have any idea how long it took to grow that?" Dad had to physically shove her out of the way to get Silas free. At the emergency room, the doctors had to shave part of Silas's head to stitch his scalp back together. When we got home, Mom wouldn't even look at him. She made him wear a wig every single day until it grew back. And if the wig slipped even a little, she'd leave the room. Silas started having nightmares and would wake up crying, and Mom told him he was being dramatic and that beauty required sacrifice. School was a nightmare with all that hair. I'd sit down in class and kids would step on it or it would get caught in my chair. One time in gym class, we were running laps and I literally tripped over my own hair and face planted on the track. I started getting these headaches that made me want to throw up. The weight of my hair felt like someone was constantly pulling on my skull. At school, I'd fall asleep at my desk and my teachers kept sending me to the nurse. Mom said I was being lazy and that plenty of men had long hair without complaining. Then things got really weird. I started feeling exhausted all the time, like completely drained even after sleeping for 12 hours. Some mornings I could barely lift my head off the pillow. My arms and legs felt so heavy. Dad kept saying I looked really pale, but Mom would interrupt and say I just needed vitamins. I'd wake up with bruises all over my body. One morning, I was brushing my teeth and my gums just started bleeding everywhere. Dad wanted to take me to the doctor, but Mom said I was fine. One day I was walking to the cafeteria and everything went black. I woke up on the floor with the school nurse next to me and a bunch of kids staring. They called an ambulance, and at the hospital, the doctors ran a ton of tests. Finally, this doctor came in and said, "Your son has leukemia and needs to start chemotherapy immediately or he'll die. His hair will need to go." I stared at my mom, who looked like she had her decision made. Her face went completely blank, like someone had just turned off all the lights inside her. The doctor was still standing there with his clipboard, and Dad had his hands pressed against his mouth. I could see Mom's jaw working like she was chewing on words she didn't want to say. She looked at me and then at the doctor, and then back at me, and I knew she was doing the math in her head about whether my life was worth more than my hair. The silence stretched out so long that the clock on the wall got really loud. Dad made this tiny gasping sound, and Mom finally opened her mouth. She said we needed a second opinion because this doctor clearly didn't understand our family values. She said there had to be other treatment options that didn't require cutting my hair. Dr. Rourke's whole face changed from patient to something harder. He explained that every single minute we waited put me in more danger because my white blood cell count was already way too low. He said the leukemia was moving fast, and if we didn't start treatment immediately, I could die. Dad made that choking noise again and grabbed the edge of the exam table. I realized he might actually stand up to her for the first time ever. Dr. Rourke looked at both of them and said he needed to step out for a moment. He left and closed the door really carefully, like he was trying not to make any noise. Mom started pacing back and forth in the tiny space. Dad was crying without making any sound, and I just sat there on the exam table feeling the paper crinkle under me. About 10 minutes went by, and then Dr. Rourke came back with another person. The new person was a man with short dark hair and was carrying a folder. He sat down in the chair across from us and said his name was Dana Fowler from the hospital social services. He explained that when parents disagree about life-saving medical treatment, the hospital has ways to make sure the child stays safe. Mom's face went bright red, and she started talking really fast about her rights as a parent. Dana just nodded and stayed completely calm. He asked if he could speak with me and Dad privately. Mom said no immediately. She said anything they needed to discuss could happen right in front of her. Dana nodded slowly, and then he picked up the phone on the wall. He spoke quietly to someone for maybe 30 seconds. 2 minutes later, a security guard showed up in the doorway. He was a big guy with a radio on his belt. Dana explained that he needed to complete a safety check, and hospital policy let him ask for privacy. He told Mom she could wait in the family lounge or security would walk her out of the building. Mom looked like she wanted to explode, but the security guard just stood there blocking the door. Mom grabbed her jacket and stormed out. The security guard followed her at a distance. As soon as they were gone, Dana turned to Dad. He asked directly if Dad gave permission for the chemotherapy and the hair removal. Dad's hands were shaking so bad he had to sit on them. He kept staring at the door like Mom might burst back through any second. I could see him trying to make his voice work. Finally, he whispered, "Yes," he said. "Yes, please save my son." Dana pulled out some official-looking forms and started writing. He explained that he was filing a report with Child Protective Services because a parent refusing life-saving medical treatment counted as medical neglect. Dad started crying harder and saying he wasn't refusing anything. He was saying yes right now. Dana's voice stayed gentle, and he said the report was about Mom's interference and the pattern of control he was already seeing. I felt this weird mix of relief and complete terror. Someone finally saw what was happening to us, but I also knew Mom was going to lose her mind when she found out. Dr. Rourke came back in and said they were admitting me right away to start chemotherapy tonight. He said my hair would need to be shaved in the next few days as the treatment kicked in. He wanted a nurse to do it in a controlled way instead of waiting for it to fall out in clumps. The way he talked about it so matter-of-fact made it feel slightly less scary, like it was just another medical thing instead of destroying everything Mom had ever valued about me. They moved me to a room on the oncology floor. A nurse named Rosa helped me change into a hospital gown. The gown was thin and had little blue diamonds on it. Dad sat in the chair by the window looking totally lost. He kept touching his own hair like he was checking to make sure it was still attached to his head. I wanted to say something to make him feel better, but I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. Rosa was already setting up this tall metal pole with bags of clear liquid hanging from it. She said that was what would save my life. About an hour later, Mom showed up at my door with some guy in a suit. The guy was carrying a briefcase and Mom was talking really loud about consent forms. They wanted to see the paperwork, and Mom's lawyer was threatening to sue the hospital. The security guard from before was back, and there was also a woman in business clothes who said she was a hospital administrator. She explained very calmly that Dad's consent was legally good enough. She said any attempt to mess with my treatment would result in a restraining order. Mom's lawyer looked uncomfortable and kept trying to get Mom to lower her voice, but Mom was ranting about parental rights and religious freedom, even though we had never been religious ever. The administrator and security guard eventually got them to leave. Around 8 at night, the first chemotherapy started. I was expecting it to hurt immediately or make me throw up, but it just felt like cold liquid going into my arm through the IV. Dr. Rourke stopped by to check on me. He said side effects usually took a few hours to show up. He also said they had given me medicine to help with nausea. Then he mentioned that Dana had arranged for Dad to stay overnight on a cot in my room. That made me feel safer, but also guilty because I knew Dad was terrified about what Mom would do when he didn't come home tonight. I tried to sleep, but my body wouldn't let me. The hospital bed was too hard, and the IV in my arm kept pulling whenever I moved, and there were all these beeping sounds from machines I didn't understand. Around midnight, I woke up feeling like someone had poured concrete into my veins. Everything was so heavy I could barely lift my arm to touch my face. There was this gross metallic taste in my mouth, like I'd been sucking on pennies, and it wouldn't go away no matter how much water I drank. Dad was still awake in the chair by the window, and his phone kept lighting up and buzzing. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. I asked what was happening, and he showed me the screen. Mom had sent like 30 texts in the past hour. The first few were asking when he was coming home. Then they got mean, saying he was betraying the family and abandoning his wife and choosing the hospital over her. The last one said if he didn't come home right now, she was going to come get him herself. Dad's hands were shaking while he held the phone. I told him to turn it off. Just turn it off and stop reading her messages. He stared at the screen for a long time, and I thought he was going to say no, that he had to keep it on in case Mom needed something. But then he pressed the power button and the screen went dark. He set the phone face down on the little table, and we both just sat there in the quiet with only the beeping machines between us. The next morning, a nurse came in to check my blood pressure and temperature. Everything felt wrong with my body, like all my bones had turned to mush. The nurse said that was normal for chemo and that it would get worse before it got better. Dad was asleep finally, curled up on the cot with his hair spilling onto the floor. Around 9, Dana knocked on the door and came in with another person. Dana introduced him as Callum and said he was from Child Protective Services and needed to ask me some questions. Callum was probably in his late 20s, way younger than I expected for someone who investigated families. He had a short, buzzed haircut that showed his whole face and neck. It felt like he was showing me on purpose what was possible. Like, look, you can have short hair and still be a whole person. He sat down in the chair next to my bed and pulled out a notebook and pen. He asked me to describe what a normal day was like at home. I started talking about the nightly hair brushing sessions that happened every single evening after dinner. Mom would make me sit on the floor between her knees while she brushed my hair for at least an hour, sometimes 2. If she found any tangles or split ends, she would inspect every single strand, and if she found damage, she'd want to know exactly what caused it. Did I brush it wrong that morning? Did I let it drag on the ground at the school? Was I not using enough conditioner? The questions would go on and on until I gave her an answer she accepted. Callum wrote everything down without saying much, and I kept talking because once I started, I couldn't stop. I told him about the wig punishment when I was 7, how Mom made me wear that huge heavy wig for 2 years because I cut 6 in off my hair. I told him about Silas's scalp injury on the swing set and how Mom just stood there staring at the hair stuck in the chain instead of helping him while he screamed. I told him how Dad's hair was so long he had to carry it in his arms to walk and how he couldn't drive because it would get caught in the car. The words just kept spilling out like someone had opened a drain in my brain. I described how tired I'd been for weeks, how I had bruises all over my body and my gums bled when I brushed my teeth. I told him Dad wanted to take me to the doctor, but Mom said I was fine, that I just needed vitamins and more sleep. Callum's pen moved across the paper the whole time, and his face stayed calm and professional. But I could see Dad in the corner, and he was crying without making any sound, just tears running down his face. Hearing everything laid out like this made it sound so much worse than it felt when we were living it. When I got to the part about the weeks of exhaustion and how Mom said I was being lazy, Callum's pen stopped moving for just a second. Then he kept writing. Dr. Rourke came in while I was still talking, and Callum introduced himself and explained why he was there. Dr. Rourke pulled up a chair and started talking directly to Callum about my cancer and the treatment plan. He said my leukemia was absolutely treatable if caught early, but it had progressed to a more dangerous level because of delayed diagnosis. He used the words medical neglect very deliberately, like he wanted to make sure Callum wrote them down exactly. Dr. Rourke explained that my symptoms were obvious, that any reasonable parent would have taken me to a doctor weeks ago when I started showing signs of serious illness. The exhaustion, the bruising, the bleeding gums, the fainting at the school. He said Mom's refusal to seek medical care because she was afraid a doctor would want to cut my hair met the legal definition of child endangerment. Dad made this small noise like he was choking and put his hand over his mouth. Callum asked Dr. Rourke specific questions about when my symptoms started and what would have happened if treatment had been delayed any longer. Dr. Rourke said very clearly that without immediate treatment, I would have died, probably within weeks. The room got really quiet after that. That afternoon, Dana came back and said the hospital's ethics committee was having an emergency meeting about my case. He explained they were reviewing whether additional legal steps were needed to protect me from Mom's interference with my treatment. Dad was invited to attend the meeting, and he looked scared, but he went. I tried to sleep while he was gone, but I kept thinking about what Dr. Rourke said, about how I would have died if we'd waited any longer. It made me feel weird to know that Mom would have let me die rather than cut my hair, like my hair mattered more to her than my actual life. Dad came back about 2 hours later, and he looked exhausted, but also different somehow, like something had shifted in his face. He sat down on the edge of my bed and told me what happened. The committee agreed that my treatment should continue with his consent alone, and Mom didn't get a say anymore. They were supporting the CPS investigation into Mom's pattern of control and medical neglect. Dad's voice was shaking when he said it, but he also sounded slightly more sure of himself, like someone had finally told him he was allowed to protect his own kid. Later that afternoon, Dana spent a long time talking with Dad in the hallway right outside my room. The door was partially open, and I could hear most of what they were saying. Dana was asking questions about finances and whether Dad had access to bank accounts or his own money. Dad's voice got really quiet, and he admitted that Mom controlled everything. He didn't have his own credit card. His name wasn't on the mortgage or the car titles. He hadn't worked in 15 years and didn't have any job skills. He didn't even know how much money was in their bank account because Mom handled all of that. Dana's response made it clear he'd heard this exact story before. He started pulling out pamphlets about emergency housing and legal aid services and programs that help people leave abusive relationships. I heard him explaining something about safety planning and how there were resources available. Dad was crying again, but this time it sounded different, less hopeless somehow. I pretended to be asleep when they came back into the room, but I watched through barely open eyes as Dana left a stack of papers on the table next to Dad's cot. On day 3, Dr. Rourke came in during morning rounds and said it was time to shave my head. He explained that the chemotherapy was starting to affect my hair follicles, and it would be less traumatic to do it now in a controlled way rather than wait for my hair to fall out in clumps over the next few few weeks. My stomach dropped when he said it, even though I knew it was coming. I'd been preparing myself for this moment my entire life in a weird way. Like every time Mom brushed my hair and told me it was my only value, I was also imagining what it would be like to not have it anymore. I was scared, but I was also weirdly ready. Dad's face went white, and he asked if he could be there when it happened. I said yes immediately because I needed him to see me do this. I needed him to see that I could survive the thing Mom always said would destroy me, that I could lose my hair and still be a whole person. Dr. Rourke said he'd send a nurse in within the hour, and then he left. Dad and I just sat there looking at each other, and I could tell he was thinking about all the years of brushing and maintaining and protecting our hair like it was the most important thing in the world. The nurse who came in was the same one from the first night, Rosa. She was carrying electric clippers and a plastic cape and a mirror. She explained exactly what she was going to do, how she'd use the clippers to buzz my hair down to almost nothing, and then we could decide if we wanted to shave it completely smooth or leave some stubble. She asked if I was ready, and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. She put the cape around my shoulders and turned on the clippers, and the buzzing sound filled the whole room. I closed my eyes because I couldn't watch. I felt the vibration against my scalp starting at the front of my head and moving back. It felt like someone was erasing me. There was this sensation of lightness, like someone had just removed a weight I didn't even know I was carrying. Pieces of my hair fell onto the cape, and I could feel them sliding down. The buzzing went on for a long time, moving over every part of my head in steady strokes. When Rosa finally turned off the clippers, the room felt too quiet. She held up the mirror and I opened my eyes. I barely recognized the person looking back at me. My head looked so small and vulnerable, and I could see the shape of my skull, and my ears stuck out more than I realized. There were little bits of hair still clinging to my scalp like dark stubble. Dad was crying, but he came over and put his hands on my face and said I looked good. For the first time in my entire life, I thought he might actually mean it. Mom found out about my hair within hours somehow. Maybe the hospital called her, or maybe she just had a feeling. She showed up around 6 a.m. that evening, and I could hear her yelling before I could see her. Security stopped her at the elevator and wouldn't let her come to my floor, but her voice carried all the way down the hall. She was screaming that we'd destroyed something precious that could never be replaced. Those were her exact words. The same thing she said when I was 7 and cut 6 in off with Dad's scissors. She was yelling about how we'd ruined everything and betrayed the family legacy, and how her father and grandfather were probably rolling in their graves. I could hear the security guard trying to calm her down and Mom just getting louder. Rosa closed my room door and turned on the TV to drown out the noise, but I could still hear her. My whole body was shaking, and I pulled the blanket up to my chin. Dad sat on the edge of my bed and held my hand. He wasn't crying anymore. His face looked hard and set, like he'd made a decision. The yelling went on for maybe 20 minutes before it finally stopped, and I figured security must have made her leave the building. That evening, Dana came back with a bunch of legal papers. He sat down with Dad and explained that Mom's behavior at the hospital proved she was a threat to my medical care and emotional well-being. He was filing for an emergency protective order that would prohibit Mom from visiting the hospital without supervision and would give Dad sole authority to make all medical decisions until a full hearing could be scheduled. The order also requested that Mom be kept away from me entirely, except for supervised visits. Dad's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen, but he signed every page where Dana pointed. I watched him sign his name over and over. This man who had never stood up to Mom in 20 years of marriage. This was the first time he'd ever taken legal action against her. The first time he'd ever chosen us over her. When Dana left with the signed papers, Dad came and sat on my bed, and we didn't say anything. We just sat there in the quiet hospital room with the TV playing some show neither of us were watching, and I reached up and touched my bald head and felt the strange new shape of myself. Around midnight, the nausea hit me like a truck, and suddenly, I was leaning over the side of the bed, throwing up into the basin Dad grabbed from the bathroom. My whole body felt weak and shaky, and I couldn't stop heaving even when there was nothing left in my stomach. Dad held the basin steady with one hand and used the other to pull my hospital gown away from my face so I wouldn't get anything on it. He kept saying he was sorry over and over like this was somehow his fault instead of just what chemo does to people. The throwing up went on for what felt like hours, and between waves of nausea, I'd collapse back on the pillow feeling like I weighed $1,000 LB. Dad wiped my face with a cold washcloth and got me little sips of water when I could keep them down. But there was something different about the way he moved around the room, something stronger in how he held himself. It was like standing up to Mom and signing those legal papers had unlocked something in him that had been buried under all that hair and all those years of fear. He wasn't asking permission to take care of me anymore. He was just doing it. The next morning, Callum came back with a yellow legal pad full of questions, and this time, he wanted to know about Silas. Dad's face went pale when Callum asked if Silas was safe at home alone with Mom, and Dad had to admit that yes, Silas was still there because we didn't have time to make other arrangements before everything happened so fast. I could see the panic in Dad's eyes when Callum explained that CPS needed to do a welfare check right away that afternoon if possible. I felt sick again, but this time it wasn't from the chemo. It was pure fear for my brother, because I knew exactly how Mom would would react when investigators showed up at the house asking questions. I begged Callum to make sure Silas was okay, and Callum promised he would personally make sure the check happened today, and that someone would call us as soon as it was done. After Callum left, Dad just sat in the chair by the window, staring at his phone like he could make it ring faster through sheer force of will. Around 4:02 that afternoon, Callum called and Dad put it on speaker so I could hear too. Callum said Silas was physically safe, no signs of injury or immediate danger, but he was clearly scared, and Mom had been really controlling during the whole interview. She kept answering questions for Silas and wouldn't let him speak freely. And when the investigator asked to talk to Silas alone, Mom made this huge deal about her rights as a parent. The investigator had documented everything about the house, and Callum said it was pretty shocking evidence of the family's obsession with hair. There were photos of Mom's grandfather everywhere, like a shrine to this man with floor-length hair. The bathroom had an entire cabinet just for hair products, $50 shampoos, and special conditioners and treatments that cost more than groceries. But the worst part was this notebook the investigator found in Mom's desk, where she had tracked the growth of my hair and Silas's hair like some kind of science experiment. She had measurements written down every month for years, notes about texture and thickness, even calculations about how long it would take to reach certain lengths. Callum said they scheduled a follow-up interview at Silas's school where Mom wouldn't be present so Silas could talk freely, and he was adding all the documentation to the CPS file. The next day, this lawyer named Vance showed up to meet with Dad, and he had kind eyes and a briefcase full of papers. Dana had connected us with him through some legal aid program that helps families in situations like ours. Vance sat down and explained that he wanted to file for emergency custody of both me and Silas, that the evidence of medical neglect combined with Mom's controlling behavior and Silas's scalp injury from the swing set created a really strong case for temporary custody modification. He used words like petitioner and respondent and temporary orders, but what it basically meant was that Dad could get legal permission to keep us away from Mom while the court figured out what to do long term. Dad looked scared, but also relieved, like he'd been waiting for someone in authority to tell him he was allowed to protect his own children. Vance said he'd start the paperwork right away and that we should have a court date within a few weeks. I ended up staying in the hospital for 8 days for that first round of chemo, and it was weird, but I actually started to feel kind of normal during that time. Not physically normal because I was tired and sick and bald, but normal in the way I got to just exist without Mom's constant presence hanging over everything. The nurses would come in and ask what I wanted to eat, and I could just say what I actually wanted instead of worrying about whether my choice would disappoint someone. Nobody timed how long I took in the bathroom or inspected what I was doing. I could sleep without worrying about someone coming in to check my hair or lecture me about taking care of something precious. Dad noticed the change too, and one afternoon, he said he couldn't remember the last time he'd seen me look relaxed. That made me sad, because it meant being in a hospital with cancer felt safer than being at home with my own mother. On day 6, Silas called Dad's phone from his friend's house, and I could hear him crying before Dad even put it on speaker. Silas was begging to come stay at the hospital with us, and his voice sounded so small and scared. He said Mom had been even worse since I left, that she was brushing his hair for hours every single night and talking about how he was the only son she had left who respected family values. She kept saying I had betrayed the family and that Silas was her last hope for carrying on the tradition. Dad told Silas to stay at his friend's house and that we were working on a plan to get him out. But I could hear Silas crying harder and it broke my heart. I had escaped, but I left my little brother behind to deal with Mom alone, and now she was focusing all her crazy on him. After the call ended, Dad just sat there holding his phone, and I saw his hands shaking. That same day, Dad's phone started buzzing with texts from numbers he didn't recognize, and when he opened them, we realized Mom was texting from different phones after he blocked her main number. The messages were getting scary, talking about how we'd destroyed the family and betrayed sacred traditions. She said Dad was manipulated by people who wanted to destroy families, and that he was going to regret choosing strangers over his wife. Then messages started coming from Mom's cousins and aunts, people Dad hadn't talked to in years, all saying basically the same thing about how Dad was wrong and Mom was right, and we were destroying something beautiful. Dana came by that evening to check on us, and when Dad showed him all the messages, Dana's face got really serious. He pulled out his laptop right there and started documenting every single message, taking screenshots and adding them to the CPS file as evidence of harassment. Then he helped Dad get a new phone number that only the hospital and the legal team would have access to. On day 9, I woke up feeling really hot and wrong, like my whole body was on fire from the inside. The nurse took my temperature and her face changed, and suddenly there were a bunch of people in my room checking my blood and hooking up new IV bags. Dr. Rourke came in and explained that my white blood cell count had dropped really low, something called neutropenia that happens sometimes with chemo. He said my body couldn't fight off infections right now, and that I needed to go to an isolation room where everyone would have to wear masks and gloves. They moved me to this room at the end of the hall that felt like being in a bubble, and suddenly I couldn't have any visitors except Dad. The fever made everything feel weird and disconnected, like like I was watching my life happen to someone else. That night, I had these horrible nightmares about my hair growing back and wrapping around my throat, choking me while Mom stood there brushing it and saying how beautiful it looked. I'd wake up gasping and reaching for my head to make sure it was still bald and safe. Dad refused to leave even when the nurses said he needed to rest and get some sleep. I woke up at 3 in the morning, and he was sitting in the chair next to my bed just watching me breathe. His eyes were red like he'd been crying. And when he saw I was awake, he started talking about how he'd been thinking about all the years he spent maintaining his hair when he could have been protecting his sons instead. He said he'd spent hours every day washing and conditioning and drying and brushing when he could have been working or saving money or building a life where we could leave. He started crying so hard he could barely talk. And I told him it wasn't his fault that Mom was the way she was, but he shook his head and said he chose to stay, and that made him responsible too. The fever finally broke after 36 hours, and I felt like a person again instead of a burning pile of nothing. While I was recovering and eating actual food for the first time in 2 days, Dana came in to talk to Dad about finances. He pulled up a chair and asked Dad directly about money and bank accounts, and Dad had to admit he had no access to anything. Mom controlled all the money. Dad didn't have his own credit card or checking account. His name wasn't on the mortgage or the car titles or any of the bills. He hadn't worked in 15 years and didn't even know how he'd support himself and 2 kids if he actually left for real. Dana didn't look surprised at all, like he'd heard this exact story 100 times before. He pulled out these pamphlets about a domestic violence program that helps people establish financial independence, and he and Dad started working on what he called a safety plan. The plan included emergency housing and food assistance and job training resources, all these things I didn't even know existed. Dana wrote down phone numbers and websites and the names of people Dad could contact, and I watched my father take notes like he was studying for the most important test of his life. Vance filed the emergency custody petition with the family court the next morning, and the clerk stamped it with a hearing date 3 weeks out. The judge who reviewed the emergency motion granted a temporary order that same afternoon, giving Dad sole medical decision-making authority and restricting Mom to supervised visits only at a location approved by CPS. The court papers got served to Mom at her work 2 days later, and according to the process server, she went completely white when she read them and had to sit down. That evening around 6:10 p.m., the security guard at the hospital called up to my floor to warn us that Mom was in the lobby demanding to see me and Dad. The guard said Mom was yelling about her rights and waving the court papers around, and when they told her she couldn't come up without supervision, she tried to push past the desk. 2 more security guards came down, and they had to physically block her from getting to the elevators. Mom kept screaming that this was her hospital too, and that nobody could keep her from her son. The guards called the police when she wouldn't leave, and 2 officers showed up and escorted her out to the parking lot. One of the cops came up to my room afterward to take a report, and he said Mom was still sitting in her car in the parking lot, just staring up at the building. The officer asked if we wanted to file for a restraining order, but Dad said the court order should be enough. Dana added the police report to the CPS file as more evidence of Mom's inability to respect boundaries. The whole thing made me feel sick, because I could picture exactly how Mom looked. That expression she got when things didn't go her way, and she couldn't understand why everyone else didn't see things the way she did. 3 days after that, Dad's phone rang during lunch, and it was a nurse from Silas's school. The nurse said Mom had shown up during the lunch period trying to take Silas out of class, claiming there was a family emergency and that Dad had sent her to pick him up. The school secretary asked for Dad's permission, and Mom got really aggressive, saying she was Silas's mother and didn't need permission from anyone. When they refused to release Silas without talking to Dad first, Mom started yelling so loud that the principal had to come out of her office. She was going on about how the school was part of some conspiracy against her and how they were keeping her son prisoner. The principal told her she needed to leave or she'd call the police, and Mom said go ahead and call them because she wasn't leaving without Silas. So they did call the police. And when the officers arrived, Mom was still in the main office arguing with the secretary. The police made her leave the building and told her she wasn't allowed back on the school property. The nurse said Silas was really shaken up because he'd heard Mom yelling from his classroom down the hall. Dad immediately called Callum and told him what happened, and Callum said he was filing an emergency removal order right then. He said this proved that Silas wasn't safe with Mom having any access to him, supervised or not. That afternoon, a social worker showed up at Silas's school during last period and pulled him out of class. The social worker explained that she was taking Silas to the hospital to stay with Dad and me because it wasn't safe for him to go home. Silas didn't even get to go back to the house to pack his stuff. The social worker said they'd arrange a supervised visit to get his clothes and schoolwork later. When Silas walked into my hospital room around 4 p.m., he just stopped in the doorway and stared. I was sitting up in bed doing homework, and I looked up and saw his face. He was staring at my bald head like he couldn't process what he was seeing. For a long moment, he didn't move or say anything, just stood there with his backpack still on and his floor-length hair pooling around his feet. Then his face just crumpled and he started crying, these big gasping sobs that shook his whole body. He dropped his backpack and ran over and threw his arms around me, and I hugged him back while he cried into my shoulder. When he finally pulled back, back and wiped his eyes. He looked at Dad and said he wanted to cut his hair, too. He said he couldn't stand it anymore, that it was too heavy and too much work, and he didn't care what Mom thought about it. His voice was shaking, but also kind of fierce, like he'd been holding this in forever, and finally had permission to say it out loud. Dad's face went through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds, and I could see him fighting between the old fear of Mom's reaction and this new determination to protect us. He took a deep breath and told Silas that we were going to figure this out together, that nobody was going to force him to keep hair he didn't want anymore. The CPS social worker came back an hour later with paperwork placing Silas in temporary protective custody with Dad as the custodial parent. This meant we were all staying at the hospital together until we could find safe housing away from Mom. The social worker said she'd arranged for someone to go to the house with police supervision to get Silas's clothes and school stuff, and that Mom wouldn't be there when they did it. The hospital brought up a second cot and set it up in my room next to Dad's, and suddenly my hospital room felt like some kind of weird refuge camp. That night, after the nurses did their final rounds and turned off most of the lights, Silas and I stayed up talking in whispers. We talked about everything Mom had put us through over the years, all the hours of hair brushing and inspection, the way she'd flip out over a single split end, how we'd both learned to move carefully so our hair wouldn't get caught on things. Silas told me about the nightmares he still had about the swing set accident, how he'd wake up feeling the chain pulling at his scalp. I told him about the wig punishment when I was 7, and how I'd been too scared to ever try cutting my hair again until cancer made the choice for me. It was the first time we'd ever been able to talk freely about any of this, without worrying Mom would overhear and punish us for being ungrateful. Dad was pretending to be asleep on his cot, but I could tell from his breathing that he was awake and listening to every word. The next morning, Silas asked one of the nurses if someone could cut his hair. The nurse looked at Dad for permission, and Dad nodded, his voice shaking a little when he said yes. The same nurse who shaved my head came in with scissors and a comb, and she had Silas sit in the chair by the window. She asked Silas how short he wanted to go, and Silas said shoulder length, just get rid of all the weight. The nurse started with the scissors, cutting off huge sections of hair that fell to the floor in thick ropes. Silas watched in the mirror the whole time with this expression I'd never seen on his face before, something between relief and disbelief. When the nurse finished and Silas's hair was just touching his shoulders, Silas reached up and ran his fingers through it. He could actually run his fingers through his hair without them getting stuck in tangles. He started laughing, this kind of shocked, happy laugh like he couldn't believe it was real. Dad was crying, but it wasn't the scared crying from before. It was this weird mix of happy tears and grief, like he was mourning all the years we'd lost while also celebrating that we were finally free. The nurse swept up all of Silas's hair from the floor and asked if we wanted to keep any of it, and Silas said no without even hesitating. Dr. Rourke came by later that morning to check on me and said I was ready to be discharged. My blood counts were stable enough that I could go home as long as I came back every week for more chemotherapy sessions. But then he paused and looked at Dad and said, of course we couldn't actually go home because of the protective order. Dad's face fell because he hadn't thought that far ahead. Dana had mentioned that the temporary shelter the domestic violence program found only had space for 1 week, and after that we'd need somewhere else to stay. Dr. Rourke said he talked to the hospital social services about options for transitional housing. Dana came back that afternoon with information about a program that provides furnished apartments for families in crisis situations. He said there was a small 2-bedroom apartment available near the hospital that we could stay in for up to 3 months while Dad looked for work, and we figured out permanent living arrangements. The apartment was part of a program specifically for domestic violence survivors, and the rent was covered by a grant, so we wouldn't have to pay anything for the first 3 months. Dana helped Dad fill out the application right there in my hospital room, and 2 days later, we got the call that we were approved and could move in whenever we were ready. We moved into the apartment on a Saturday morning with just the bags of clothes that Dana had helped Dad pack during a supervised visit to the house while Mom was at work. A police officer had gone with them to make sure Mom didn't come home early, and Dad said it was the strangest feeling to walk through his own house like a stranger, grabbing only what we absolutely needed and leaving everything else behind. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building, and it was tiny and kind of run down with carpet that was worn thin in spots and kitchen cabinets that didn't close all the way. But it had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom and a lock on the door that Mom didn't have a key to. That first night, we didn't have much furniture yet besides what came with the apartment, so we ordered pizza and ate sitting on the living room floor. Silas said this felt like the first real home we'd ever had, and I knew exactly what he meant. The house we'd grown up in had always felt like Mom's museum for her hair obsession, but this little apartment with its worn carpet and squeaky floors belonged to us. Dad got connected with a job training program through the domestic violence services, and he started going to classes 3 days a week to learn basic computer skills and office software. He was scared out of his mind because he hadn't worked since before I was born and didn't even know how to use a spreadsheet or email properly. But the program was designed for people in his exact situation, people who'd been out of the workforce for years because of controlling partners. They helped him put together a resume that emphasized his volunteer work and the accounting he'd done for Mom's business, and they had him practice interviewing until he could answer questions without his voice shaking. 2 weeks into the program, the instructor told him about a part-time job doing data entry for a medical billing company that let employees work from home. Dad applied and got hired within 3 days. The pay was only $12 an hour, but it was his own money in his own bank account that Mom couldn't touch. Dana gave me a journal with a blue cover and told me it might help to write things down. At first, I didn't know what to say, but then I started writing about everything, just letting it all pour out onto the pages. I wrote about the years of nightly hairbrushing sessions and how Mom would inspect every inch for damage. I wrote about the wig punishment when I was 7 and how heavy it was and how the other kids made fun of me. I wrote about Silas's accident on the swing set and the blood and Mom's reaction. I wrote about feeling exhausted all the time and the bruises and how Mom said I was just being lazy. I wrote about the cancer diagnosis and shaving my head and this weird feeling of freedom that came with being bald. Some days I wrote angry entries about Mom and everything she'd stolen from us. Other days I wrote about being scared that the cancer would kill me anyway and that all of this would be for nothing. Writing it all down made it feel more real somehow, like I was creating evidence that this actually happened and wasn't just some nightmare. Dana said both kinds of feelings were completely valid and that I should keep writing whatever came into my head. Vance came to the apartment one evening to prepare us for the custody hearing that was now 2 weeks away. He sat at our kitchen table with a folder full of papers and explained that Mom's lawyer was arguing that Dad had kidnapped us and that the whole situation was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by social workers who were too quick to interfere. Vance said we had strong evidence on our side, including medical records, CPS reports, hospital documentation of Mom's interference with my treatment, the police reports from her attempts to violate the court order, and statements from my teachers and doctors. But he warned us that family court could be unpredictable and that we needed to be prepared for the possibility that the judge might order some kind of visitation even if Dad got custody. He said judges were sometimes reluctant to completely cut off a parent's rights unless there was evidence of physical abuse, and what Mom did was mostly psychological control and medical neglect, which could be harder to prove. Dad's hands were shaking as he signed the papers Vance needed, but his signature was steady and clear. The next morning, Dana called Dad's phone, and his voice sounded different, like he was trying to stay professional, but also mad. He told Dad that Mom had started posting all over social media about us, claiming the hospital kidnapped her sons, and that Dad was brainwashed by people who hate families. Dad pulled up her page on his laptop, and there were like 20 posts from the past 12 hours, each one with old photos of me and Silas with our super long hair. The captions talked about how beautiful we used to be, and how the system destroyed us and took away our crowning glory. There were pictures I didn't even know she had, including one from when I was maybe 5 years old with my hair spread out on the grass like some kind of creepy photo shoot. People were commenting and sharing the posts, and some of Mom's relatives were writing things about how Dad betrayed the family and how we were being held against our will. Dana told us to screenshot everything, but not to respond or engage with any of it. He explained that this was actually good for our case because it showed the judge exactly what Mom cared about most. Every single post focused on our hair and our appearance. Not once did she mention my health or the cancer or whether I was okay. Dana added all the screenshots to the evidence file and said Mom was basically building our case for us by putting her obsession on public display for everyone to see. 3 days later, I went back to the hospital for my second chemotherapy session. This time I knew what to expect, so I wasn't as scared when they hooked up the IV. I'd packed snacks that were supposed to help with nausea, and I wore comfortable clothes and brought my journal to write in during the long hours of sitting there. The infusion took about 4 hours, and I felt the same weird coldness going into my veins and the metallic taste in my mouth, but I'd taken the anti-nausea medication before we even left the apartment. So when the sick feeling hit, it wasn't as bad as the first time. Dr. Rourke came by to check on me halfway through, and he looked at my chart and said my blood counts were improving. He explained that meant the cancer was responding to treatment and shrinking, which was exactly what we wanted to see. I asked him how long I'd have to keep doing this, and he said probably 6 months of treatment total, maybe longer depending on how my body responded. He reminded me there would be setbacks and bad days, but so far everything was going according to plan. After he left, I sat there watching the clear liquid drip into my arm and felt this strange mix of grateful and angry. Grateful that the chemo was working and killing the cancer cells, but angry that I had to be here at all because Mom waited so long to get me help. Dad squeezed my hand and didn't say anything, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing. A few days after that, Nadia, who ran the teen cancer support group at the hospital, stopped by during one of my checkups. She was maybe 30 years old with short hair that was growing back in after her own cancer treatment, and she had this really calm way of talking that made you feel less alone. She invited me to come to the support group that met every Thursday evening in one of the conference rooms. I told her I didn't know if I wanted to sit around talking about cancer with a bunch of other sick kids, but she said I should just try it once and see. That Thursday, Dad drove me to the hospital, and I walked into the conference room feeling super nervous. There were about 8 other teenagers sitting in a circle, some with no hair like me, and some wearing hats hats or scarves. Nadia started the meeting by asking if anyone wanted to share what was going on with their treatment. This boy named Jonah, who looked about 16, raised his hand and talked about how he'd been in treatment for 2 years and was finally in remission. Then he said something that made me sit up straighter. He talked about how getting cancer actually freed him from his parents' expectations about who he was supposed to be. Before cancer, his parents had his whole life planned out with football and straight A's and the perfect college and med school after that. But when he got sick, all of that fell away, and he realized he didn't want any of it. He said cancer gave him permission to figure out who he actually was, instead of who everyone else wanted him to be. His story was totally different from mine, but also exactly the same. He talked about control and expectations and finally getting to make his own choices. After the meeting ended, I went up to Jonah and we talked for like 20 minutes about what it felt like to have your body become a battleground for other people's issues. He gave me his number and said to text him anytime I needed to talk to someone who understood. That same week, Silas started seeing a therapist named Dr. Osi, who worked with kids from controlling families. Dad found her through the domestic violence program, and Dr. Osi had evening appointments so Silas could go after school. The first few sessions, Silas came home quiet and wouldn't really talk about it. But then one night at dinner, he said Dr. Osi told him that what Mom did with the hair control met the definition of psychological abuse. He said Dr. Osi explained that the scalp injury from the swing set should have resulted in a CPS investigation years ago, and that teachers and doctors were supposed to report that kind of thing. Silas looked relieved when he talked about it, like someone finally confirmed that our family wasn't normal, and he wasn't crazy for thinking it was wrong. Around the same time, Dad started going to a support group for survivors of domestic abuse. He went every Tuesday night and would come back looking exhausted, but also somehow lighter. He told us the group helped him see patterns he didn't recognize before, like how Mom isolated him from friends and family and controlled all the money and made him feel like he couldn't survive without her. Watching both of them start to heal made me realize how sick our whole family system was. It wasn't just me with cancer. We were all sick in different ways, and we were all learning how to get better. 10 days before the custody hearing, Vance called to tell us that Mom's lawyer had sent a message. Mom wanted to meet with us to apologize before the court date. Vance said it over speakerphone so we could all hear, and his voice was really serious when he told us he strongly advised against it. He explained that this was probably a manipulation tactic to make Mom look good for the judge, like she could say she tried to reconcile and we refused. Dad asked what would happen if we said no, and Vance said the judge wouldn't hold it against us, that we had every right to maintain boundaries. I felt this weird curiosity about what Mom would even say, whether she was capable of understanding what she did wrong, or if she'd just try to convince us to come home. But Dad made the decision for all of us. He told Vance to decline the request and said we weren't ready for that and might never be ready. Vance said that was completely reasonable, and he'd respond to Mom's lawyer right away. After the call ended, Silas looked relieved, and Dad looked determined, and I realized that Dad was finally learning to protect us instead of protecting Mom's feelings. Vance came over to the apartment 2 days later with a folder full of papers. He said the judge might want to hear from me directly at the hearing, so we needed to prepare a statement just in case. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked me to describe what I wanted the judge to know. I started talking about the nightly hair brushing sessions that lasted hours, about the wig punishment when I was 7, about Silas's scalp injury and Mom's reaction, about feeling exhausted and sick for weeks, while Mom said I was just being lazy. Vance typed everything I said into his laptop and then printed it out for me to practice reading. The first time I tried to read it out loud, I started crying before I even got through the first paragraph. Vance said showing emotion was okay, and that the judge needed to see how this affected me, but I also needed to be able to get through the whole thing. We practiced for over an hour with Dad sitting next to me holding my hand. Vance recorded me on Dad's phone so I could watch myself and get more comfortable with the words. By the end, I could read the whole statement without completely breaking down, though my voice still shook on the parts about Mom refusing to take me to the doctor. Vance said I was doing great and that my testimony could make a real difference in the judge's decision. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. When I finally did fall asleep, I had this nightmare that I was back home in my old bedroom. Mom was sitting on the edge of my bed, brushing my hair like she used to. Except in the dream, my hair was growing back super fast. Long strands were sprouting from my head and wrapping around my neck and arms like chains. The more Mom brushed, the longer it grew, and I couldn't breathe because it was choking me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, and Mom just kept brushing and smiling like everything was normal. I woke up gasping, and my hands flew to my head, feeling the smooth skin and the short stubble that was starting to grow back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. Dad must have heard me because he came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed. We didn't turn on the light, just sat there in the dark together. He asked if I was okay, and I told him about the dream. He was quiet for a minute, and then he said tomorrow would change everything one way or another. He said no matter what the judge decided, we weren't going back to living like that. We sat there for a long time talking about what might happen at the hearing and what we'd do afterward. Eventually, I fell back asleep with Dad still sitting there, and this time, I didn't dream at all. The custody hearing started at 9 in the morning in a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and something I couldn't quite name. Maybe fear, or maybe just years of people's problems soaking into the walls. Mom was already there when we arrived, sitting at a table with her lawyer. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen before, and her hair was neatly done. She looked like a completely normal, respectable mother who'd been wronged by the system. She didn't look at us when we walked in, and I didn't look at her either. The judge was a woman probably in her 50s with gray hair and glasses. She looked tired, like she'd seen 1,000 cases just like ours. She sat down at the big desk at the front and explained that this hearing would determine temporary custody and medical decision-making, while the CPS investigation continued. She said both sides would present evidence and testimony, and then she'd make a ruling based on what was in the best interest of the children. Vance stood up first to present our side. He laid out the timeline of events, starting with my cancer diagnosis and Mom's interference with treatment. I watched the judge's face carefully to see if anything he said made her react, but her expression stayed completely neutral. Callum was the first person to testify. He walked to the front and swore to tell the truth with his hand on a Bible. Then he sat down in the witness chair, and Vance started asking him questions. He described his investigation and what he found when he visited our house. He talked about the photos of Mom's grandfather covering the walls, the cabinets full of expensive hair products, the notebook where Mom tracked our hair growth like some kind of science experiment. He presented printed photos of the house as evidence, and the judge looked at each one carefully. Vance asked about the documented history of control, and Callum explained the wig punishment from when I was 7 and Silas's scalp injury from the swing set. He read directly from his report about how Mom stood there asking about the hair while Silas was bleeding and screaming. The judge asked if Mom was ever physically violent, and Callum said no. The abuse was psychological and medical rather than physical, but he emphasized that psychological abuse could be just as damaging as physical abuse, sometimes even more so because it was harder to see and harder to prove. Dr. Rourke testified next through a video call on a big screen at the front of the courtroom. He explained my cancer diagnosis and the type of leukemia I had. He described the symptoms I'd been showing for weeks, the exhaustion and bruising and bleeding gums that any reasonable parent should have recognized as signs of serious illness. He stated clearly that Mom's refusal to seek medical care when I was obviously sick constituted medical neglect. Then he talked about the progression of my cancer during those weeks of delay, how it went from early stage to more advanced because of the lack of treatment. He explained Mom's attempts to prevent me from receiving chemotherapy and how she focused on my hair instead of my survival. The judge asked if my prognosis was good now that treatment had started. Dr. Rourke said yes, but emphasized that any further delays or interruptions could be catastrophic. He said I needed consistent treatment for at least 6 months and that my father had been fully cooperative with the medical team while my mother had been actively obstructive. The judge took notes during the whole testimony, and I could see her writing faster during certain parts, especially when Dr. Rourke talked about how the delay could have killed me. Vance stood up and called Dad to the witness chair. He walked to the front with his hands shaking and sat down after putting his hand on the Bible. Vance started asking him questions about the marriage, and Dad's voice came out quiet at first, but got stronger as he talked. He described how Mom controlled what he wore and how he styled his hair and who he could see. He explained that over 20 years, she slowly cut him off from his friends and family until he had nobody except her. He talked about the nightly hairbrushing that could go on for 3 or 4 hours while Mom inspected every inch for damage. He described how she would make him stand in front of her while she checked for split ends and how she'd get angry if she found even one. Dad explained that he had no access to bank accounts and no credit cards in his name, and that Mom controlled every dollar that came into the house. His voice shook when he talked about being too scared and too broke to leave, but he didn't cry. He looked right at the judge and said he should have protected us sooner, but he's protecting us now and he'll never let Mom control us again. The judge wrote notes the whole time and asked a few questions about specific incidents. When Vance finished, Dad walked back to sit with us and his whole body was trembling. Mom's lawyer stood up next and started presenting their defense. He argued that Mom came from a culture where long hair on men was deeply valued and that her beliefs were protected under religious freedom. Mom took the stand and testified that she never meant to hurt anyone. She said she was just trying to preserve family traditions that had been passed down through generations. She talked about her grandfather and father and how hair was sacred in her family. She claimed the cancer diagnosis was a shock and that she only hesitated about treatment because she needed time to process such a big change. Her lawyer showed photos of Mom's father and grandfather with hair down to their ankles, trying to make it look like cultural heritage instead of abusive control. Mom kept using words like tradition and values and sacred, and her lawyer nodded along like this was all perfectly reasonable. I watched the judge's face to see if she was buying any of it, but her expression stayed neutral. The judge asked Mom directly why she didn't take me to a doctor when I was showing symptoms of serious illness. Mom stumbled over her answer and said she thought I was just tired from the school. She said Dad was overreacting and that teenagers are always exhausted. The judge pointed out that multiple people, including teachers, noticed I was sick. She asked if Mom's concern about my hair influenced her decision not to seek medical care. There was a long pause where Mom just sat there looking at her lawyer. Finally, she admitted that she she was worried a doctor might want to cut it. The courtroom went completely quiet. Even Mom's lawyer looked uncomfortable. The judge wrote something down, and her pen moved fast across the paper. The judge didn't need to question me directly, which made relief flood through my whole body because I didn't think I could face Mom in person. Vance presented my written statement instead. He read parts of it out loud, describing the wig punishment when I was 7 and the daily hair inspections, and how Mom made us spend hours on hair care. He added the medical records, showing how my cancer got worse during the weeks Mom refused to take me to a doctor. The judge took the papers and read through everything carefully. I watched her face and saw her expression get harder when she reached the part about the wig punishment. She flipped through the medical records and compared them to the timeline in my statement. After both sides finished presenting evidence, the judge said she needed 30 minutes to review everything. We went to a small room down the hall to wait. Dad held my hand so tight it almost hurt, but I didn't pull away. Silas was with us and he kept asking if we were going to have to go back home with Mom. Vance tried to prepare us for different possible outcomes. He explained that the judge might order shared custody or supervised visits or full custody to Dad. He said we had a strong case, but that family court could be unpredictable. I could tell from his face that he thought we'd win, but he didn't want to promise anything. The 30 minutes felt like 3 hours. Dad's leg bounced up and down the whole time, and Silas chewed on his thumbnail until it bled. When we returned to the courtroom, the judge had papers spread out in front of her. She looked at Dad and then at Mom and started reading her ruling. She granted Dad temporary sole legal custody of both me and Silas. She gave Dad sole medical decision-making authority. Mom was allowed supervised visitation once per week for 2 hours, supervised by a professional monitor that she had to pay for. The judge also ordered Mom to attend therapy focusing on control and parenting issues. She said the current arrangement would stay in place for at least 6 months, while Mom demonstrated she could respect boundaries and put her children's well-being over her personal beliefs. I felt Dad's hand squeeze mine even tighter, and I heard him make this small sound like he was trying not to cry. Mom's face went completely white. For a second, I thought she might jump up and start yelling right there in the courtroom. Her lawyer grabbed her arm and whispered something in her ear. Mom just sat there looking like someone had died. The judge added that any attempt to contact us outside of supervised visitation or any violation of the court order would result in suspension of all visitation rights. She looked directly at Mom when she said this, and her expression made it clear she wasn't making an idle threat. Mom's lawyer nodded and said they understood. Mom didn't say anything at all. We left the courthouse through a side exit to avoid running into Mom. Vance walked with us to Dad's car in the parking garage. He explained that this was a really good outcome. He said sole custody and supervised visitation meant we were protected while still technically preserving Mom's parental rights. Dad started crying with relief and had to lean against the car. Silas and I were both kind of numb with the realization that we actually won. A judge believed us and chose our safety over Mom's feelings. When we got back to the apartment that evening, Dad made spaghetti and we ate at the small kitchen table without anyone timing us or inspecting us or watching our every move. Dad's phone lit up with Mom's number twice, and both times he declined it and forwarded the call log to Vance like he'd been told to do. About 2 weeks after that, on a Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of the bathroom door closing and then this weird cutting noise like scissors going through something thick. I got out of bed and walked to the bathroom door just as Dad came out holding a huge pile of hair in his arms. His hair was cut to shoulder length and he looked absolutely terrified, but also lighter somehow, like he'd just put down something heavy he'd been carrying for 20 years. He stood there shaking and said he couldn't carry that weight anymore, literally or metaphorically. That watching me go through chemo and Silas cut his hair had made him realize he was still letting Mom control him, even though she wasn't here. His hair had been past his knees since before I was born, and watching it fall to the bathroom floor felt like watching chains break and scatter. Silas and I grabbed scissors and helped him even it out because Dad's hands were shaking too badly to do it himself, and we all ended up crying, but it was the good kind of crying that means something is finally over. We swept up the hair and put it in a garbage bag, and Dad carried it out to the dumpster like he was throwing away evidence of a crime.